There's nothing quite like the pain of losing something sacred, something that held your prayers for decades. Sister Agnes felt that crushing weight when she found her beloved golden cross stolen from St. Mary's altar, the same cross that had comforted 3 generations of her congregation. The police called it vandalism, another crime in a struggling neighborhood, but 8-year-old Zora saw something different that night. She knew the real truth about what happened to the cross. Her words would change everything Sister Agnes believed, about her community and the people she thought she knew. Sometimes what looks like a crime is actually a cry for help. What did little Zora see that would turn this story of loss into something beautiful? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the fractured stained glass of St. Mary's, casting broken rainbows across the sanctuary floor where Sister Agnes knelt in prayer. Her worn leather prayer journal lay open beside her, its pages filled with 43 years of handwritten pleas, thanksgivings, and quiet conversations with God. Each entry told a story. Births celebrated, deaths mourned, marriages blessed, and sins forgiven within these sacred walls. Sister Agnes had arrived at St. Mary's as a young woman of 25, fresh from the convent with idealistic dreams of serving God's people. Now, at 68, her hands showed the wear of countless hours spent in service, scrubbing floors, preparing communion, tending to the sick, and holding the hands of the dying. The prayer journal had been her constant companion through it all, a repository of her deepest thoughts and unwavering faith. The neighborhood around St. Mary's had changed dramatically over the decades. What had once been a thriving working-class community filled with young families had slowly transformed into something harder, more desperate. The factories that once provided steady employment had closed one by one, leaving behind empty buildings and even emptier promises. Many of the original parishioners had moved away, seeking opportunities in distant suburbs, while those who remained struggled with poverty, unemployment, and the daily challenges of survival. Yet Sister Agnes had stayed. Through every wave of change, every crisis, every moment when others suggested the church should relocate to a more prosperous area, she had remained steadfast. This was her calling, her home, her purpose. The people here needed St. Mary's, perhaps more than those comfortable congregations in affluent neighborhoods ever would. The church itself bore witness to both struggle and persistence. Built in 1924, with donations from Irish and Italian immigrants, its brick facade had weathered nearly a century of seasons. The wooden pews, hand-carved by parishioners during the Great Depression, still bore the subtle indentations left by generations of folded hands and bowed heads. The Stations of the Cross, painted by a local artist in 1953, had faded over time but retained their power to inspire contemplation and prayer. Behind the altar, the Golden Cross had presided over countless services, weddings, funerals, and moments of both joy and sorrow. It wasn't made of solid gold. The congregation had never been wealthy enough for such luxury. Rather, it was brass, carefully gilded and polished until it gleamed like precious metal. To the people of St. Mary's, its true value had never been monetary. The cross represented continuity, faith, and the enduring presence of the divine in their daily struggles. Father Miguel Rodriguez had joined the parish 3 years ago, bringing youthful energy and a fresh perspective to complement Sister Agnes's seasoned wisdom. At 34, he understood the challenges facing urban parishes and had quickly earned the respect of the community through his willingness to meet people where they were, not just spiritually, but practically. He organized job training programs, helped families navigate social services, and never hesitated to roll up his sleeves for community service projects. Mrs. Dorothy Patterson had served as the church secretary for over 20 years. Her desk, positioned strategically near the entrance where she could greet visitors, answer questions, and keep a watchful eye on the comings and goings of parish life. At 72, she possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every family's history, every child's birthday, and every crisis that had touched their community. Her filing cabinets contained records dating back decades, but her true archive was her remarkable memory for the human stories that gave meaning to the data. The discovery of the break-in had shattered the peaceful rhythm of Sister Agnes's morning routine. She had arrived at 6 o'clock, as she had every morning for over 4 decades, expecting to prepare the sanctuary for the day ahead. Instead, she found the side door forced open, its frame splintered where someone had pried it apart with considerable force. The sanctuary was in chaos. Hymnals scattered across the floor, candles knocked over, the altar cloth torn and stained with what appeared to be mud from someone's boots. But it was the empty space behind the altar that had brought Sister Agnes to her knees in anguish. The golden cross was gone, leaving only 4 dark holes in the wall where the mounting brackets had been torn away. Someone had taken time and effort to remove it carefully, suggesting this wasn't random vandalism, but a targeted theft. Detective Robert Harrison arrived within an hour of Sister Agnes's call to the police. At 46, he had investigated countless break-ins throughout the city, but church thefts always affected him more deeply. Something about violating a sacred space struck him as particularly cruel, even when the perpetrators were likely desperate rather than malicious. He photographed the scene methodically, dusted for fingerprints on the damaged door and altar area, and interviewed Sister Agnes with gentle professionalism. "I have to ask, Sister," Detective Harrison said as he closed his notebook, "was there anything else of value taken? Sometimes these break-ins escalate once thieves realize how easy it is to access a building." Sister Agnes shook her head slowly. "The poor box was untouched. The chalices and candlesticks are still here. They only wanted the cross." Her voice carried a weight of bewilderment that touched the detective's heart. "That's unusual," he admitted. "Most church thefts involve multiple items, whatever's easiest to carry and sell quickly. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were looking for." Word of the theft spread through the neighborhood with the speed that bad news always travels. In close-knit communities, by afternoon, a small crowd had gathered outside St. Mary's, neighbors expressing outrage, offering support, and sharing theories about who might be responsible. The local newspaper sent a reporter, and the evening news featured a brief segment about the vandalism at historic church. Sister Agnes found herself overwhelmed by the attention and the well-meaning but often unhelpful suggestions from community members. Some called for increased security measures, cameras, alarms, locked doors during the day. Others demanded that police patrol the area more frequently, or that the city do something about the criminal element they believed was destroying their neighborhood. Through it all, Sister Agnes retreated into prayer and reflection, seeking guidance about how to respond to this violation of her sacred space. The Golden Cross had been more than decorative art. It had been the focal point of worship, the symbol that drew eyes and hearts upward during moments of celebration and grief alike. Its absence left a wound in the sanctuary that seemed to echo with every footstep. That evening, as Sister Agnes knelt in her familiar spot before the altar, she opened her prayer journal and began to write. Her words flowed across the page, expressing not anger or demand for justice, but a deep sadness at the loss of something that had meant so much to so many people. She wrote about the couples who had exchanged vows beneath that cross, the children who had been baptized in its presence, the grieving families who had found comfort in its enduring symbol of hope and resurrection. The church felt different without the cross, emptier, somehow incomplete. Sister Agnes understood that the building's holiness didn't depend on any single object, but she also knew that symbols mattered deeply to human hearts seeking connection with the divine. The cross had been their North Star, their constant reminder that love conquers death, that suffering has meaning, that redemption is always possible. As she closed her journal and prepared to leave for the night, Sister Agnes noticed a small figure sitting in the back pew. 8-year-old Zora Williams sat quietly, her dark eyes serious and thoughtful in a way that seemed beyond her years. The little girl had been coming to St. Mary's with her grandmother for the past 6 months, ever since her family had moved to the neighborhood. She was a bright child, curious and observant, who often lingered after services to ask questions about the stories told in stained glass windows or the meaning behind liturgical symbols. "Hello, Zora," Sister Agnes said gently, approaching the pew where the child sat. "It's getting late, dear. Does your grandmother know where you are?" Zora nodded solemnly. "She's talking to Mrs. Patterson about the food pantry. Sister Agnes, I need to tell you something important about what happened to the cross." Something in the child's tone made Sister Agnes pause. She settled into the pew beside Zora, giving her full attention. "What is it, sweetheart? I saw what really happened that night," Zora said quietly. "It wasn't what everyone thinks. It wasn't bad people trying to hurt the church." Sister Agnes felt her heart quicken. "What did you see, Zora?" The little girl looked toward the empty space where the cross had hung, her expression mixing sadness with something that might have been understanding. "I saw Marcus crying when he took it down. He was being very careful not to break anything else, and Teresa was with him, and she was crying too. They didn't look like they wanted to steal it. They looked like they had to." The words hung in the air between them, challenging everything Sister Agnes thought she understood about the theft. Marcus Thompson and Teresa Valdez, she knew these children, had watched them grow up in the neighborhood, had seen them struggle with the challenges that poverty placed in their paths. The idea that they might be responsible for the break-in seemed impossible, yet Zora's quiet certainty was difficult to dismiss. "Are you sure it was Marcus and Teresa?" Sister Agnes asked gently. Zora nodded. "I know them from school. Marcus helped me when some bigger kids were being mean last month. He's not a bad person, Sister Agnes. Neither is Teresa. Something must be really wrong for them to do something like this." As Sister Agnes walked home that night through streets she had traveled safely for decades, Zora's words echoed in her mind. The child's simple observation that good people sometimes do desperate things when faced with impossible circumstances challenged the neat categories of victim and perpetrator that everyone else seemed eager to embrace. Perhaps there was more to this story than anyone imagined. Perhaps the real vandalism wasn't the theft of a golden cross, but the conditions that drove children to believe stealing from their church was their only option. As Sister Agnes prepared for bed, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for the police to solve the case, she would seek the truth herself, beginning with a conversation with 2 teenagers who might be carrying burdens far heavier than anyone realized. The next morning arrived with the kind of grey December sky that made everything look older and more worn than it actually was. Sister Agnes found herself arriving at St. Mary's earlier than usual, her mind still wrestling with Zora's revelation from the night before. The child's colored pencil drawing lay folded in her pocket, a hastily sketched scene that Zora had pressed into her hands before leaving with her grandmother. The drawing was remarkably detailed for a child's work. It showed 2 figures carefully removing something from a wall, while a third, smaller figure watched from what appeared to be a window. The attention to detail was striking. Zora had even included the specific pattern of cracks in the church's side entrance and the distinctive shape of the oak tree that grew beside the building. But most importantly, the drawing captured something the police report had missed: The body language of the figures suggested reluctance rather than eagerness, sorrow rather than greed. As Sister Agnes unlocked the church and stepped into the sanctuary, she was struck again by the stark emptiness where the golden cross had hung. The morning light revealed the full extent of the damage more clearly than the previous day's emotional chaos had allowed. While the thieves had been selective about what they took, their entry had been forceful. The splintered doorframe would need repair, and several of the wooden pews bore scuff marks where heavy boots had scraped against them. Mrs. Patterson arrived at her usual time, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the determined expression she reserved for particularly challenging days. At 72, Dorothy Patterson had seen the neighborhood weather many storms, and she possessed the kind of practical wisdom that came from decades of helping families navigate crisis after crisis. "Any word from the police?" she asked, settling at her desk and immediately beginning to sort through the sympathy cards and offers of help that had arrived in yesterday's mail. Detective Harrison said they're investigating, but church thefts are difficult to solve unless someone tries to sell the items locally, Sister Agnes replied, her voice carrying the weight of disappointment. He seemed to think we should prepare ourselves for the possibility that we may never see the cross again. Mrs. Patterson looked up from her correspondence, her experienced eyes reading the conflict in Sister Agnes's expression. "But you don't think this was a typical theft, do you?" Sister Agnes hesitated, then pulled Zora's drawing from her pocket and smoothed it out on Mrs. Patterson's desk. The older woman examined it carefully, adjusting her reading glasses and taking in every detail the child had captured. "This is quite specific," Mrs. Patterson observed. "Zora saw this happen?" "She says she did, and she identified the people involved." Sister Agnes took a deep breath before continuing. "She believes it was Marcus Thompson and Teresa Valdez." The statement hung between them like a challenge to everything they thought they understood about their community. Mrs. Patterson had known both teenagers since they were small children, attending vacation Bible school and Christmas pageants. Marcus had been an altar server until high school demands made scheduling difficult. Teresa had volunteered in the church nursery and helped with younger children during Sunday services. "That doesn't make sense," Mrs. Patterson said finally. "Those children have never been in trouble. Marcus works after school to help his grandmother with expenses. Teresa's one of the most responsible teenagers I know." "That's exactly what makes Zora's account so troubling," Sister Agnes admitted. "If she's right, then we're not dealing with random vandals or career criminals. We're looking at young people from our own community who felt desperate enough to steal from their church." The morning passed slowly, punctuated by phone calls from concerned parishioners, visits from neighbors offering support, and the arrival of a contractor to provide estimates for repairing the damaged door. Through it all, Sister Agnes found herself watching the street for any sign of Marcus or Teresa, wondering how she might approach them and what she would say if given the opportunity. Around noon, as Sister Agnes was preparing to visit some of the elderly parishioners who had been particularly distressed by news of the theft, she noticed a familiar figure walking past the church. Marcus Thompson moved with the careful posture of someone trying to appear casual while actually feeling deeply uncomfortable. He was tall for his age, 16 years old, but already showing the broad shoulders and strong hands that suggested he would grow into his father's imposing frame. His clothes were clean but worn, and his backpack looked like it had seen several academic years of heavy use. Sister Agnes made a quick decision that would prove pivotal to everything that followed. Instead of continuing with her planned visits, she stepped outside and called to Marcus. "Marcus, could I speak with you for a moment?" The teenager's reaction was immediate and telling. His shoulders tensed, and he turned toward her with an expression that mixed guilt, fear, and resignation in equal measure. For just a moment, Sister Agnes saw past the careful composure he usually maintained and glimpsed the frightened boy beneath. I heard about what happened, Marcus said as he approached, his voice carefully neutral. That's really terrible, Sister Agnes. The cross meant a lot to people. The use of past tense didn't escape Sister Agnes's notice, nor did the genuine sadness in his voice. This wasn't the response of someone indifferent to the church's loss, but rather someone who understood exactly what had been taken and what it meant to the community. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me, Sister Agnes said gently. A witness saw what happened that night. They identified you and Teresa. The effect of her words was immediate and devastating. Marcus's careful composure crumbled entirely, and Sister Agnes watched as 16 years of trying to be strong for everyone around him finally overwhelmed his capacity to pretend. He sank onto the church steps, put his head in his hands, and began to cry with the raw, desperate sound of someone who had been carrying an impossible burden alone. Sister Agnes sat beside him on the cold stone steps, not speaking, simply offering her presence while he wept. She had learned, over 4 decades of ministry, that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the space to fall apart safely, knowing they won't be abandoned in their moment of greatest vulnerability. When Marcus finally looked up, his eyes were red, but his voice was steady. We didn't want to hurt anybody. We never wanted to steal from the church. But Teresa's mom is dying, and they don't have insurance, and the hospital won't do the surgery without money up front. The words tumbled out in a rush, as if holding them back had been causing physical pain. Teresa's been working every day after school, and I've been giving her everything I make at the store, but it's not enough. It's never enough. Her mom's got maybe 2 weeks before they can't wait anymore. Sister Agnes felt her heart breaking as the full scope of the situation became clear. These weren't hardened criminals or thoughtless vandals. They were children trying to save someone they loved, children who had exhausted every legitimate option and turned to theft only as a last resort. "Why didn't you come to the church for help?" she asked softly. Marcus's laugh was bitter and exhausted. "With what? The poor box has maybe $40 in it on a good week. Father Miguel's been trying to help families with rent and utilities. There's nothing left for something like this. The surgery costs $18,000. The number hit Sister Agnes like a physical blow. $18,000, more money than St. Mary's raised in 3 months of regular collections, more than most families in their neighborhood saw in a year. To Teresa and Marcus, the Golden Cross must have seemed like their only hope, the one item in their world that might possibly be valuable enough to save a life. "Where is the cross now?" Sister Agnes asked. "We haven't sold it yet," Marcus said quickly. "We've been trying to figure out how to do it without getting caught. Teresa keeps saying maybe there's another way. Maybe we shouldn't go through with it, but her mom's getting worse every day." As they sat together on the church steps, Sister Agnes realized that this moment would define not just Marcus and Teresa's future, but her own understanding of what it meant to serve God's people. The easy path would be to call Detective Harrison, report what she had learned, and let the justice system handle 2 teenagers who had committed a serious crime. The harder path would be to find a way to address the real problem, a family facing medical bankruptcy and 2 young people who had been forced to make an impossible choice. "Marcus," she said finally, "I need you to bring Teresa to see me tonight, and I need you to bring the cross. Can you do that?" He nodded, relief and fear warring in his expression. "Are you going to turn us in?" Sister Agnes looked at this child. She had baptized as an infant, confirmed as a young adolescent, and watched grow into a young man of remarkable character, despite circumstances that would have broken many adults. "I'm going to help you find another way," she said. "But first, I need to understand everything that's happened and everything that's at stake." As Marcus walked away, Sister Agnes remained on the steps, watching him disappear around the corner, while her mind raced with possibilities. Zora's simple drawing had opened a door to a complex human drama that challenged every assumption about crime, punishment, and the meaning of justice. Tomorrow would bring difficult conversations, painful truths, and decisions that would ripple through multiple lives. But tonight, for the first time since discovering the theft, Sister Agnes felt a spark of hope. The Golden Cross wasn't lost. It was hidden, waiting to be part of a larger story about love, desperation, and the possibility of redemption that looked nothing like what anyone had expected. That evening, as winter darkness settled over the neighborhood earlier than anyone ever expected it to, Sister Agnes found herself pacing the sanctuary with an energy born of both anxiety and anticipation. The conversation with Marcus had shifted something fundamental in her understanding of the situation, transforming what had seemed like a simple crime into something far more complex and heartbreaking. She had spent the afternoon visiting Mrs. Williams, Marcus's grandmother, and the woman who had raised him since his parents died in a car accident when he was 9 years old. Eleanor Williams was 74 years old, a woman whose hands told the story of a life spent cleaning houses, taking care of other people's children, and stretching every dollar until it screamed for mercy. Her small apartment was immaculate, despite its age, filled with photographs of Marcus at various stages of his childhood and academic achievement certificates that spoke to his consistent excellence in school. "I've been worried about that boy," Mrs. Williams admitted as she poured Sister Agnes a cup of coffee that was stronger than anything served at church functions. "He's been different these past few weeks. Quiet, carrying something heavy, you know what I mean. I raised 6 children of my own and helped raise a dozen grandchildren. I know when a child is bearing weight that's too much for their shoulders." Sister Agnes had chosen her words carefully, not wanting to betray Marcus's confession while still trying to understand the full scope of his circumstances. "Has he mentioned Teresa's family situation?" Mrs. Williams nodded slowly. "That sweet girl's been through more than any teenager should have to handle. Her mama's illness has been hard on all of them. Marcus has been giving Teresa money from his job at Patterson's Market, and I know he skipped meals to do it. I tried to tell him that wasn't his responsibility, but you know how these young people are when they love someone." The weight of that revelation had settled heavily in Sister Agnes's chest. Marcus wasn't just trying to help his girlfriend. He was sacrificing his own basic needs to support a family facing an impossible medical crisis. The kind of devotion that drove a 16-year-old to give up his own food so that someone else might have a chance at life-saving surgery was the same kind of love that might drive him to steal from his own church. Patterson's Market sat on the corner where the neighborhood's main commercial strip intersected with the residential streets that housed most of St. Mary's parishioners. It was the kind of small, independent grocery store that had somehow survived the invasion of chain supermarkets by focusing on personal service and accepting that many customers would need to buy groceries on credit until payday arrived. Mr. James Patterson, the store's owner and Mrs. Patterson's nephew, had hired Marcus 6 months earlier after the boy had applied for work at every business within walking distance of his grandmother's apartment. At 62, James had inherited both the store and a philosophy of community responsibility from his father, who had opened Patterson's Market in 1963 with a commitment to serving families that the larger stores often ignored. "Marcus is the most reliable employee I've ever had," James told Sister Agnes when she stopped by to purchase supplies for the church food pantry. "Never missed a day, never complained about working extra hours, always treats customers with respect. But lately, he's been asking for advance pay more often. Said his grandmother had some unexpected expenses." Sister Agnes nodded, understanding. Now that Marcus had been lying to protect both his grandmother and Teresa's family from embarrassment, the advance pay had been going directly to help with Teresa's mother's medical costs. Another sacrifice in a long series of sacrifices that painted a picture of a young man with an extraordinary sense of responsibility. The worn basketball that sat beside the store's back door told its own story. Marcus had been a promising player in his freshman and sophomore years, with natural athletic ability that suggested he might earn a college scholarship if he continued developing his skills. But the basketball now sat unused, gathering dust, while Marcus worked every available hour to earn money for someone else's crisis. He used to practice every day after work, James continued, following Sister Agnes's gaze. Had dreams of playing college ball, but something changed this semester. Started saying he was too busy, had more important things to focus on. Another sacrifice, another dream deferred in service of love and loyalty. Sister Agnes began to understand that the theft of the Golden Cross wasn't an isolated act of desperation, but rather the culmination of months of increasingly difficult choices. Marcus had been systematically giving up pieces of his own future, meals, dreams, opportunities, in a futile attempt to solve a problem that was simply too big for a teenager's resources to address. As evening approached, Sister Agnes returned to St. Mary's to wait for Marcus and Teresa to arrive with the Golden Cross. The sanctuary felt different in the darkness, more intimate and somehow more honest than it did during regular worship services. Without the cross behind the altar, her eyes were drawn to other details she had perhaps taken for granted: the way candlelight flickered across the worn wooden pews, the subtle variations in color in the stained glass windows that told stories of faith and sacrifice. She opened her prayer journal and began to write, trying to capture the complex emotions that Marcus's confession had stirred in her heart. For 43 years, she had ministered to people facing impossible choices, but she had always been able to offer some form of concrete help. Emergency funds from the church discretionary account, referrals to social services, connections to other charitable organizations. This situation felt different, larger, more desperate than anything her usual resources could address. The side door opened softly, and Sister Agnes looked up to see Marcus and Teresa entering the sanctuary together. Teresa Valdez was 17, a year older than Marcus, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and the kind of serious expression that suggested she had been forced to grow up faster than most teenagers. She carried herself with dignity, despite wearing a coat that was clearly too large for her and shoes that had seen better years. In Marcus's hands was a carefully wrapped bundle that could only be the Golden Cross. Even through the cloth covering, its familiar shape was unmistakable, the symbol that had presided over countless moments of joy and sorrow, now hidden away like stolen treasure rather than displayed as a beacon of hope. Teresa's eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Sister Agnes, I want you to know that this wasn't Marcus's idea. I convinced him to help me. If anyone's going to get in trouble for this, it should be me." The loyalty between these two teenagers was immediately apparent, each trying to protect the other, each willing to accept blame and consequences for decisions they had made together. Sister Agnes felt her heart breaking anew as she recognized the depth of love that had driven them to this desperate act. "Before we talk about blame or consequences," Sister Agnes said gently, "I need to understand the full situation. Teresa, tell me about your mother's condition." As Teresa began to speak, her carefully maintained composure finally cracked, and the words poured out like water through a broken dam. The story she told was one of medical bureaucracy, insurance limitations, and the impossible mathematics of healthcare costs that trapped families between hope and bankruptcy. Her mother's cancer had returned after 2 years of remission, but this time the recommended treatment wasn't covered by their limited insurance plan. "The doctor says without the surgery, she has maybe a month," Teresa whispered. "With it, she could have years, but $18,000 might as well be 18 million for us. My dad's been working double shifts and I've been working every day after school, but we can't even come close. Sister Agnes looked at these two young people, children really, despite the adult burdens they carried, and realized that she was witnessing love in its purest, most desperate form. They hadn't stolen the cross for personal gain or selfish reasons. They had taken it as a last resort, a final attempt to save someone they couldn't bear to lose. The golden cross sat between them, wrapped in cloth, but somehow still radiating. The weight of everything it represented: faith, hope, community, and now the terrible burden of impossible choices made by people who had nowhere else to turn. Teresa's story unfolded like a map of heartbreak, each detail revealing another layer of the impossible situation that had driven two teenagers to break into their own church. Her mother, Maria Valdez, had been a house cleaner for most of Teresa's childhood, working for families in the wealthier neighborhoods across town. The work was physically demanding but steady, and it had allowed the family to maintain a modest but dignified life in a small apartment near St. Mary's. When Maria was first diagnosed with cancer 3 years earlier, the family had navigated the complex world of treatments, insurance claims, and medical appointments with the determination that comes from having no other choice. The initial surgery and chemotherapy had been covered by the basic health insurance plan that came with Maria's employment, though the family had struggled with co-payments and the income lost during Maria's recovery period. The remission had felt like a miracle. For 2 years, Maria had been able to return to work, though at a reduced capacity. Teresa had watched her mother slowly regain strength and begin to believe that the worst was behind them. The family had even begun to hope that Teresa might be able to accept the partial scholarship she had been offered to the state university, a dream that had seemed impossible during the darkest days of Maria's illness. Then the cancer returned, more aggressive than before and resistant to the treatments that had been successful the first time. The experimental procedure that offered the best hope for long-term survival wasn't covered by their insurance because it was still considered investigational. The hospital required payment in advance, $18,000 that might as well have been 18 million for a family whose savings had been depleted by the first round of medical bills. My dad took a second job driving for a delivery service, Teresa explained, her voice barely above a whisper. He works from 6 in the morning until midnight most days. My little brother Carlos started asking why Papa never smiles anymore, and my sister Rosa stopped talking about her quinceañera because she knows we can't afford it. Sister Agnes felt the weight of each detail, understanding how the medical crisis had rippled through every aspect of the family's life. The stack of medical bills that Teresa described, notices marked "final" in red letters, phone calls from collection agencies, the constant anxiety about money that transformed every household decision into a source of stress, painted a picture of a family being systematically destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. We tried everything, Teresa continued, tears flowing freely now. We applied for charity care at the hospital, but they said we make too much money to qualify. Too much money. My dad makes $11 an hour and my after-school job pays minimum wage. We looked into medical loans, but our credit isn't good enough because of the bills from Mum's first treatment. Marcus reached over and took Teresa's hand, offering silent support as she struggled to continue her story. Sister Agnes could see how the weight of the situation had affected both teenagers. The dark circles under their eyes spoke of sleepless nights, and their thin frames suggested they had been skipping meals to save money for Teresa's mother's care. I found out about the cross when I was helping Mrs. Patterson organize the church archives last month, Teresa admitted. There was an old insurance appraisal from 1995 that valued it at $12,000. I thought maybe if the gold content was worth that much 25 years ago, it might be worth more now with inflation. The revelation explained the careful, targeted nature of the theft. This hadn't been random vandalism or opportunistic crime. It had been a desperate, calculated attempt to save a life using the only resource that seemed potentially valuable enough to make a difference. We spent weeks trying to figure out another way, Marcus added. I asked my boss about more hours, but the store can't afford to pay me more. Teresa applied for every scholarship and emergency assistance program we could find online. We even thought about starting one of those fundraising websites, but who's going to donate $18,000 for people they don't know? The practicality of their desperation struck Sister Agnes as particularly heartbreaking. These weren't children making impulsive decisions. They were young people who had methodically exhausted every legitimate option before turning to theft as a last resort. The night we took it, Teresa's mom had another episode, Marcus continued. She collapsed at work, and the paramedics said her blood pressure was dangerously high. The doctor at the emergency room said we were running out of time. Teresa nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. I couldn't sleep that night thinking about losing her. My mom is only 42 years old. She should have decades left to see Carlos graduate, to dance at Rosa's wedding, to meet her grandchildren. The idea that she might die because we don't have enough money felt like the cruelest thing in the world. Sister Agnes understood now why Zora's drawing had captured figures who looked reluctant rather than eager, sorrowful rather than greedy. The theft had been an act of love, performed by people who understood exactly what they were taking and what it meant to their community, but who felt they had no other choice. We haven't tried to sell it yet, Teresa said quickly. We've been calling pawn shops and jewelry stores, trying to figure out how to get it appraised without raising suspicions. But honestly, we're scared. We've never done anything like this before. We don't know how to be criminals. The admission revealed the fundamental innocence that had driven their desperate act. These weren't hardened thieves with experience in fencing stolen goods. They were children who had taken something precious and now had no idea how to transform it into the life-saving medical care they desperately needed. Sister Agnes looked at the wrapped cross sitting on the pew between them and realized that this moment would define not only Marcus and Teresa's future, but her own understanding of justice, mercy, and what it truly meant to serve God's people. The easy path would be to call the police and let the legal system handle two teenagers who had committed a serious crime. But the harder path, the one that required her to grapple with the systemic failures that had driven these children to desperation, offered the possibility of real healing rather than mere punishment. Teresa, I need to ask you something difficult, Sister Agnes said gently. If we find another way to help your mother, if we can somehow raise the money for her surgery without selling the cross, would you be willing to face the consequences of what you've done? Teresa's response was immediate and certain. Yes, if my mother can live, I'll accept whatever punishment comes. I know we did something terrible, even if we did it for good reasons. Marcus nodded in agreement, his jaw set. With determination. We never wanted to hurt the church or you, Sister Agnes. If there's a way to make this right and still save Mrs. Valdez, we'll do whatever it takes. The courage and integrity of these two teenagers in the face of their desperate circumstances moved Sister Agnes deeply. They had made a terrible choice, but they had made it from love rather than greed, from desperation rather than malice. The distinction mattered, not because it excused their actions, but because it suggested a path forward that might serve justice while also serving mercy. I need some time to think and pray about this, Sister Agnes said finally. Can you keep the cross safe for another day or two while I figure out what we're going to do? Teresa nodded eagerly. We've been keeping it hidden in my bedroom closet, wrapped in my old communion dress. My parents don't go through my things, so it's been safe there. the image of the sacred cross wrapped in a child's white communion dress, a symbol of innocence and faith, protecting another symbol of hope and redemption, struck Sister Agnes as both heartbreaking and somehow deeply appropriate. These children were still, in many ways, the same innocent souls who had received their first communion in this very sanctuary, now caught in circumstances that had forced them to choose between their moral convictions and their love for family. As Marcus and Teresa prepared to leave, Sister Agnes made a decision that surprised even herself. "Before you go, I want you to know that I don't see you as criminals. I see you as children who love your family enough to sacrifice everything for them. That kind of love, even when it leads to wrong choices, is something sacred," Teresa began, to cry again, but this time the tears seemed to carry relief as much as sorrow. "Thank you for not hating us," she whispered. "Hate you." Sister Agnes reached out and took both teenagers' hands in hers. "I've spent 43 years in ministry, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've encountered love as pure and selfless as what you've shown your family. The challenge now is finding a way to channel that love toward solutions that don't require breaking your own hearts or betraying your own values." After Marcus and Teresa left, Sister Agnes remained in the sanctuary for another hour, praying and thinking about the complexity of the situation that had been placed in her hands. The Golden Cross was safe, but that was only the beginning of addressing the real crisis. A woman's life hung in the balance. 2 teenagers faced potential criminal charges, and a community needed to grapple with the systemic issues that had created such an impossible situation in the first place. She opened her prayer journal and began to write, trying to capture not just the events of the evening, but the profound questions they raised about faith, justice, and community responsibility. How could a society that claimed to value life and family create circumstances where children had to choose between crime and losing a parent? What did it mean to serve God's people when the systems designed to help them were so inadequate that desperate families fell through every safety net? The medical bills Teresa had described, the impossible mathematics of healthcare costs, the insurance limitations that left families choosing between financial ruin and death, weren't unique to the Valdez family. Sister Agnes had counseled dozens of parishioners over the years who faced similar crises. The difference was that Marcus and Teresa had been brave enough or desperate enough to take action when all legitimate options had been exhausted. As she prepared to lock the church and head home, Sister Agnes realized that solving this crisis would require more than just finding $18,000. It would require addressing the underlying conditions that had made theft seem like a reasonable option to 2 fundamentally good children. It would require building systems of community support that could catch families before they fell so far that they saw no legitimate way back up. The neighborhood around St. Mary's was full of families living on the edge of financial catastrophe, one medical emergency or job loss away from the kind of desperation that had driven Marcus and Teresa to break into their own church. If the community could find a way to help the Valdez family, they might also discover ways to prevent other families from facing similar impossible choices. Walking home through the familiar streets, Sister Agnes found herself noticing details that had perhaps become invisible through decades of routine. The houses that needed repairs their owners couldn't afford, the apartments where multiple families crowded together to split rent costs, the corner market where people bought groceries with food stamps and asked Mr. Patterson to hold items until payday arrived. This was her community. These were the people she had committed her life to serving. The theft of the Golden Cross had revealed not just the desperation of 2 teenagers, but the broader needs of a neighborhood where good people were struggling with problems too large for them to solve alone. Perhaps the real vandalism wasn't the theft of a sacred object, but the social and economic conditions that had driven children to see stealing from their church as their only hope for saving someone they loved. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Sister Agnes was preparing for the early morning service when Mrs. Patterson's voice crackled through the church phone with unusual urgency. "Sister, you need to get down to Patterson's Market right away. There's been some kind of incident with Marcus, and Mr. Patterson is asking for you specifically." Sister Agnes arrived at the market to find Marcus sitting in the small office behind the customer service counter, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly as he held a crumpled piece of paper. Mr. Patterson stood nearby with an expression that mixed concern, confusion, and what appeared to be disappointment. "Tell Sister Agnes what you just told me," Mr. Patterson said gently, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had just learned something difficult about a person he cared about. Marcus looked up with eyes that had clearly been crying, and Sister Agnes felt her heart sink as she realized that their careful secret had somehow been exposed. "Someone called the store this morning," Marcus said, his voice barely audible. "They said they knew I had stolen something valuable from St. Mary's, and that if I didn't pay them $500, they would call the police and tell them where to find it." The pawn shop receipt that had fallen from Marcus's pocket told part of the story. Sister Agnes recognized it immediately, the slip of paper that represented Marcus's desperate attempt to understand the value of what they had taken. But seeing it crumpled in his trembling hands, she realized it had become something far more dangerous, evidence that someone else could use to destroy two teenagers who were already drowning in circumstances beyond their control. "I wasn't trying to sell anything," Marcus explained quickly, looking back and forth between Sister Agnes and Mr. Patterson. "I just wanted to know what it might be worth, in case we decided we couldn't go through with it. But the pawn shop owner got suspicious when I described it. He must have called someone, maybe the police, maybe someone else who figured out what was going on." Mr. Patterson's expression softened as he began to understand that the situation was more complex than a simple case of employee theft. He had known Marcus for 6 months, had watched him work harder and more honestly than employees twice his age, had seen him give up lunch breaks to earn extra money for what he claimed were his grandmother's medical expenses. "Marcus," Sister Agnes said carefully, "where is the item now?" "Still where Teresa's keeping it," Marcus replied. "We haven't done anything with it yet. We keep talking about it, but every time we get close to actually trying to sell it, one of us backs down. It feels too wrong, you know." The moral struggle that had kept Marcus and Teresa from following through on their desperate plan revealed the fundamental goodness that had been battling with their desperation all along. They had taken the cross in a moment of crisis, but their consciences had been preventing them from completing the act that would transform them from people who had made a terrible mistake into people who had irreversibly crossed a line they could never uncross. Sister Agnes looked at the pawn shop receipt more carefully, noting the address and the name of the establishment. Rodriguez Pawn and Jewelry was located in a part of town she knew primarily through the stories of parishioners who had been forced to sell family heirlooms to pay rent or buy groceries during particularly difficult months. The owner, Miguel Rodriguez, had a reputation for honest dealing, but also for being alert to suspicious transactions that might involve stolen goods. "Mr. Patterson," Sister Agnes said, "could Marcus and I have a few minutes alone?" After the store owner stepped out to help a customer, Sister Agnes turned her full attention to the frightened teenager sitting across from her. Marcus looked younger than his 16 years, stripped of the careful composure that usually helped him navigate the adult responsibilities that had been placed on his shoulders. "Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully," she said. "I think I know a way to solve this problem, but it's going to require you and Teresa to trust me completely. Are you willing to do that?" Marcus nodded without hesitation. "Sister Agnes," At this point, I'll try anything that doesn't involve Teresa getting in trouble. This was all my idea anyway. She just went along with it because I convinced her it was the only way to save her mom. The loyalty and protectiveness in his voice reminded Sister Agnes of why she had been so moved by these teenagers from the beginning. Even facing extortion and potential criminal charges, Marcus's primary concern remained protecting someone else, shouldering blame that rightfully belonged to both of them in order to spare Teresa additional consequences. First, we're going to call Detective Harrison and explain the situation, Sister Agnes said, watching Marcus's face carefully for his reaction. You're going to turn us in? Marcus asked, his voice hollow with resignation. No, I'm going to ask for his help, Sister Agnes replied. Detective Harrison is a good man who understands the difference between malicious crime and desperate circumstances. If we approach this the right way, he might be able to help us deal with whoever is trying to extort you without making your situation worse. The concept of the police as potential allies rather than enemies was clearly foreign to Marcus, who had grown up in a neighborhood where interactions with law enforcement were typically confrontational rather than collaborative. But Sister Agnes had built relationships with several officers over the years, particularly Detective Harrison, who had handled previous incidents at St. Mary's with sensitivity and wisdom. Second, we're going to have an honest conversation with your girlfriend about what she's been carrying alone, Sister Agnes continued. Teresa told me about her mother's condition, but I suspect there's more to the family's situation that even... You don't know, Marcus looked confused. What do you mean? I mean that teenage girls often protect the people they love by not telling them how bad things really are, Sister Agnes explained. Teresa strikes me as someone who would work herself to exhaustion and worry herself sick before she would admit that the situation was beyond her ability to handle. The observation hit home immediately. Marcus's expression shifted as he began to consider how much Teresa might have been hiding from him in an effort to spare him additional worry. Their relationship had been built on mutual support and shared sacrifice, but Sister Agnes suspected that Teresa had been carrying burdens she hadn't shared with anyone, including the boy who was willing to risk everything to help her. Third, we're going to visit Teresa's family and see the situation for ourselves, Sister Agnes said. Not as investigators or judges, but as people who want to help. Sometimes the problems that seem impossible from the inside look different when viewed by someone with fresh eyes and different resources. Marcus's expression began to shift from despair toward something that might have been cautious hope. Do you really think there might be another way to help Mrs. Valdez? I think that two teenagers shouldn't have to choose between committing crimes and watching someone they love die, Sister Agnes replied. And I think that a community that allows children to face that kind of choice has failed in its most fundamental obligations. The pawnshop receipt remained crumpled in Marcus's hand, a symbol of desperate measures and dangerous consequences. But as they talked, Sister Agnes began to see it differently. Not as evidence of guilt, but as a starting point for understanding how many people in their community were living so close to the edge that a single crisis could push them into circumstances that felt impossible to escape through legitimate means. As they prepared to leave Patterson's Market together, Sister Agnes realized that solving this crisis would require more than just preventing two teenagers from being prosecuted for theft. It would require building the kind of community support systems that could catch families before they fell so far that crime began to look like a reasonable option. The Valdez family lived in a second-floor apartment above a laundromat, the kind of building where the walls were thin enough that neighbors inevitably became intimately familiar with each other's struggles. Sister Agnes climbed the narrow stairs with Marcus beside her, both of them carrying grocery bags filled with items from St. Mary's food pantry, not as charity, but as a gesture of solidarity from one family to another during a difficult time. Teresa, answered the door with surprise written across her face, clearly not expecting to see Sister Agnes and Marcus together in the middle of a school day. She was wearing her school uniform, but had obviously been home for several hours. Her books scattered across a small kitchen table that also served as homework desk, dining room, and workspace for the family's various activities. Sister Agnes. "Marcus, is everything okay?" "We need to talk, all of us together," Sister Agnes said gently. "Is your mother well enough for visitors?" Teresa hesitated, and Sister Agnes could see the internal calculation happening, the teenager's instinct to protect her family's privacy, warring with her desperate need for help. "She's having a good day today," Teresa finally said, "but she tires easily." The apartment was small but meticulously clean, filled with the kind of furniture that had been carefully maintained for many years, beyond its original intended lifespan. Family photographs covered every available surface: school portraits, birthday parties, church events, and candid moments that spoke to the deep love that bound these people together despite their current circumstances. Maria Valdez sat in a worn recliner near the window, wrapped in a blanket despite the afternoon warmth. At 42, she looked simultaneously younger and older than her years. Younger in her bright eyes and ready smile, older in the way illness had marked her face and thinned her frame. Her honor roll certificate from Teresa's junior year hung prominently on the wall nearby, a testament to academic achievement that had been earned despite circumstances that would have derailed many students. "Mrs. Valdez, I'm Sister Agnes from St. Mary's," she said, settling into a chair that Teresa quickly pulled over. "I've heard so much about you from Teresa, and I wanted to meet you personally." Maria's smile was warm despite the evident fatigue that shadowed her features. "Teresa talks about you often, sister. She says you've been very kind to her, letting her help with the church programs even when her work schedule makes it difficult." The conversation that followed revealed layers of complexity that neither Marcus nor Sister Agnes had fully understood. Maria had been working as a house cleaner for the same family for 8 years, but her illness had forced her to reduce her hours significantly. The family she worked for had been understanding, even generous, allowing her to maintain health insurance coverage and providing some flexibility with her schedule. But the experimental treatment that offered the best hope for long-term survival wasn't covered by any insurance plan, no matter how generous. "We've applied for assistance from every organization we could find," Maria explained, her voice growing weaker as she talked. "The hospital has a charity care program, but our income is too high to qualify. There are foundations that help with cancer treatment, but they're overwhelmed with applications, and most of them have waiting lists that are months long." Teresa's father, Carlos Valdez, arrived home while they were talking, his work clothes, bearing the dust and fatigue of a construction job that required him to be on his feet for 10 hours a day. At 45, he carried himself with the dignity of a man who had always provided for his family through honest labor. But Sister Agnes could see the strain that months of impossible choices had etched into his features. "Teresa told you about her mother's situation?" he asked, settling wearily into a kitchen chair that creaked under his weight. Sister Agnes nodded. "She did, and I want you to know that I'm not here to judge anyone or to offer easy answers that don't address the real problems you're facing." Carlos looked surprised by her directness. "Most people who want to help start by telling us about programs we've already tried or suggesting that we should have saved more money, as if anyone in this neighborhood has $18,000 sitting in a bank account." The bitterness in his voice reflected months of frustration with systems that seemed designed to help everyone except the people who needed help most desperately. Carlos had been working double shifts, taking on weekend jobs and selling everything the family could spare. But the mountain of money required for Maria's surgery remained impossibly out of reach. "Papa," Teresa said softly, "there's something Marcus and I need to tell you. Sister Agnes watched as Teresa found the courage to confess everything to her parents, the theft of the Golden Cross, the desperate plan to sell it for her mother's surgery, the growing realization that they had no idea how to transform their crime into the life-saving medical care they needed. Carlos's face went through a series of emotions as he listened: shock, anger, disappointment, and finally a devastated understanding of how desperate his daughter had become. "Mia," he said finally, his voice breaking, "how could you risk your future like that? If you get arrested, if you get a criminal record, what happens to your college dreams?" "What good are college dreams if Mama dies while I'm studying?" Teresa replied, tears streaming down her face. "What's the point of having a future if the people I love most don't get to be part of it?" Maria struggled to sit up straighter in her chair, her face showing a mixture of horror and heartbreak. "Teresa, baby, you can't throw away your life trying to save mine. That's not how this works. That's not what I want." "But it's what I want," Teresa said fiercely. "Marcus and I talked about it for weeks before we did anything. We researched every other option. We applied for loans, for grants, for charity care. We tried everything legitimate first. Taking the cross wasn't our first choice, it was our last choice." Sister Agnes listened to this family pour out months of accumulated pain, fear, and impossible decisions, understanding now why Marcus and Teresa had been willing to risk everything for someone they loved. The Valdez family wasn't asking for a handout or expecting someone else to solve their problems. They had been fighting this battle with every resource at their disposal, and theft had seemed like their only remaining option when all legitimate avenues had been exhausted. "Mr. and Mrs. Valdez," Sister Agnes said when the emotional storm had subsided somewhat, "I want to propose something that might sound impossible, but I think it's worth trying." Carlos looked at her with the skeptical expression of someone who had heard too many well-meaning suggestions that turned out to be impractical. "What kind of proposal?" "I want to try organizing the community to raise the money for Maria's surgery," Sister Agnes said. "Not through anonymous charity or distant fundraising, but through direct community action, people helping people because that's what communities are supposed to do." The silence that followed her suggestion was heavy with years of accumulated disappointment and failed hopes. Teresa was the first to speak. "Sister Agnes, we live in a poor neighborhood. Most of our neighbors are struggling with their own problems. How could they possibly raise $18,000? By working together in ways that multiplied individual contributions into something larger than any one person could accomplish. Alone," Sister Agnes replied, "and by recognizing that Maria's crisis today could be any of our crises tomorrow." As she looked around the small apartment at this family that had been brought to the edge of desperation by circumstances beyond their control, Sister Agnes realized that the theft of the Golden Cross had revealed something much larger than individual criminal behavior. It had exposed the inadequacy of systems that left families choosing between financial ruin and death, and the willingness of fundamentally good people to make terrible choices when faced with impossible circumstances. The honor roll certificate hanging on the wall seemed to watch over their conversation, a reminder that Teresa's academic excellence had been achieved despite poverty, family illness, and the kind of daily stress that would overwhelm many adults. The idea that such a remarkable young woman might sacrifice her future for her mother's life spoke to both the depth of family love and the cruelty of systems that forced such choices upon people who deserved better. Sister Agnes was preparing to leave the Valdez apartment when a soft knock interrupted their conversation. Teresa opened the door to find Mr. Chen, the elderly owner of the small grocery store 2 blocks from St. Mary's, standing in the hallway with an envelope in his weathered hands. "I hope I'm not intruding," Mr. Chen said politely, his voice carrying the careful precision of someone speaking in a second language, he had mastered through decades of practice. I heard voices and wanted to make sure Mrs. Valdez was feeling well today. At 78 years old, Henry Chen had been a fixture in the neighborhood for over 40 years, ever since he had immigrated from Taiwan with his wife and young son. His store, Chen's Corner Market, occupied a narrow building between a barber shop and a check-cashing service, serving customers who often paid with food stamps and sometimes asked him to hold items until payday arrived. "Please, Mr. Chen, come in," Maria said from her recliner, her face brightening at the sight of their elderly neighbor. "You're always welcome here." Mr. Chen entered the apartment with the careful movements of someone whose joints reminded him a daily of his age, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent as they took in the scene. Sister Agnes with her grocery bags, Marcus standing protectively near Teresa, the evidence of a serious family conversation that had been interrupted by his arrival. "I don't want to interrupt," he said, "but I have something that belongs to the Valdez family." He held out the envelope, and Sister Agnes noticed that his hands shook slightly. Not from age, she realized, but from emotion. Teresa accepted the envelope with confusion, opening it to reveal a cashier's check made out to Maria Valdez for exactly $18,000. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Sister Agnes felt her understanding of the entire situation shift fundamentally as she stared at the check that represented everything Marcus and Teresa had been desperately trying to obtain through theft. "Mr. Chen," Carlos said finally, his voice hollow with shock, "where did this come from?" The elderly man settled slowly into the chair that Teresa quickly offered, his expression mixing relief with something that might have been embarrassment. "From savings," he said simply, "from 40 years of putting aside a little money each month for emergencies." "But this is $18,000, Teresa whispered, staring at the check as if it might disappear at any moment. "This is everything we need for Mama's surgery." Mr. Chen nodded. "I know. I've been listening to your family's struggle for months, watching you work multiple jobs, seeing you get thinner and more worried every week. I've been trying to figure out how to help without offending your pride." Sister Agnes found herself speechless as she began to understand the full implications of what she was witnessing. The anonymous donation envelope that Mr. Chen had brought wasn't just a financial gift. It was evidence that the community had been watching and caring all along, that the isolation and desperation Marcus and Teresa had felt were not as complete as they had believed. "I heard about the trouble at the church," Mr. Chen continued, his eyes finding Marcus and Teresa with gentle understanding. "Word travels fast in a small neighborhood, especially when young people are involved in something unusual. I realized that good children don't steal from their church unless they're facing something impossible." Marcus's face went pale as he understood that their secret had been exposed, not just to Sister Agnes, but potentially to the broader community. "Mr. Chen, we never meant—" "I know what you meant," the elderly man interrupted kindly. "You meant to save someone you love. That's not a crime of the heart, even if it might have been a crime in the eyes of the law." Teresa was crying now, clutching the check with trembling hands. "Mr. Chen, this is too much. This is your life savings. We can't accept something this huge from you." "You can and you will," Mr. Chen said with gentle firmness. "Do you know what? I've been saving money for all these years, for my funeral, for final expenses, for things that won't matter if I don't live to see this community take care of its own people." The revelation transformed Sister Agnes's understanding of the neighborhood dynamics she had thought she knew so well. Mr. Chen had been quietly observing the struggles of families around him, accumulating resources not for his own comfort, but for the opportunity to make a difference when the need was greatest. "But now you've given away your security," Carlos protested, his voice thick with emotion. "What happens if you have your own emergency?" Mr. Chen smiled with the serene expression of someone who had made peace with a difficult decision. "I'm 78 years old, Mr. Valdez. I have good health, a successful business, and more than enough money left for anything I might need. What I don't have is unlimited time to make a difference in people's lives." Sister Agnes felt tears in her own eyes as she watched this act of extraordinary generosity unfold. The anonymous donation envelope represented more than financial assistance. It embodied the kind of community care that she had been trying to foster through St. Mary's programs for decades. "There's something else you should know," Mr. Chen continued, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing a small notebook. "I haven't been the only one watching and worrying about your family." He opened the notebook to reveal pages of handwritten entries, names, amounts, and dates that documented months of quiet community support that the Valdez family had never realized they were receiving. "Mrs. Rodriguez from the laundromat has been washing your clothes for free when she thought you weren't looking," he read. "Mr. Patterson has been providing groceries at cost, and sometimes below cost. The mechanic on 3rd Street fixed your car's transmission for parts only. Father Miguel has been paying your utility bills through the church discretionary fund." Each entry in Mr. Chen's notebook revealed another layer of community support that had been operating invisibly around the Valdez family's crisis. The network of care that Sister Agnes had been hoping to build already existed. It had been functioning quietly, modestly, without fanfare or recognition. "People have been helping all along?" Maria asked, her voice filled with wonder and gratitude. "People have been trying to help," Mr. Chen corrected gently, "but $18,000 for surgery was beyond what any of us could manage individually. It required someone with the resources to make a single large contribution." Sister Agnes realized that the theft of the Golden Cross had occurred not because the community didn't care about the Valdez family, but because the family hadn't understood how much the community did care. Marcus and Teresa had felt alone with their desperate situation, when in fact they had been surrounded by people who were looking for ways to help. "The cross," Marcus said suddenly, understanding dawning in his voice. "We don't need to sell the cross now." "You never needed to sell the cross," Mr. Chen said kindly. "You needed to trust that people who care about you would find a way to help. When the crisis was big enough to require it," Teresa looked back and forth between the cashier's check and Sister Agnes, her expression mixing relief with confusion. "But what about what Marcus and I did? We still stole from the church. We still broke the law." Sister Agnes stood up, feeling the weight of responsibility for how this situation would be resolved. The Golden Cross was safe. Maria's surgery was now funded, and 2 teenagers who had made a terrible choice out of love rather than greed were looking to her for guidance about what came next. "What you did was wrong," she said gently, "but what you did was also understandable. The question now is whether we use this situation to punish people who made a desperate choice, or whether we use it to build the kind of community where people don't have to choose between crime and losing someone they love." The anonymous donation envelope sat on the kitchen table between them, a symbol of hope that had arrived just in time to prevent a tragedy that would have destroyed multiple lives. But Sister Agnes understood that the real miracle wasn't the money itself. It was the discovery that the community had been caring all along, waiting for the right moment and the right opportunity to transform individual concern into collective action. As she prepared to leave the Valdez apartment with Marcus beside her, Sister Agnes realized that the theft of the Golden Cross had revealed something far more valuable than what had been taken. It had exposed a network of community care that had been operating quietly in the shadows, and it had shown that even in the poorest neighborhoods, people possess the resources to take care of each other when they work together with intention and love. That evening, Sister Agnes sat alone in the sanctuary of St. Mary's with her prayer journal open before her, trying to capture the profound transformation that had occurred over the past few days. The church registry book lay beside her journal, a worn leather volume that contained the names of every person baptized, confirmed, married, or buried within these walls over the past century. As she turned through the pages, Sister Agnes saw the interconnected stories of families who had supported each other through generations of joy and sorrow. The Thompson family, Marcus's grandmother Eleanor, had been baptized here in 1949, had married her late husband in 1967, and had brought Marcus for his infant baptism after his parents died. The Valdez family, Teresa had received her first communion here, and her parents had been married in a small ceremony that Mrs. Patterson still remembered fondly. The Chen family, Henry's wife, had been buried from St. Mary's 5 years earlier, and their son had graduated from the church's small religious education program before moving to California for work. Page after page revealed the deep roots that connected seemingly disparate neighbors into something larger than the sum of their individual struggles. But the registry also revealed something troubling that Sister Agnes had been trying to avoid, confronting directly. Over the past decade, fewer and fewer young families had joined the parish. Many of the names from recent years belonged to elderly parishioners or families facing crises that had brought them to the church seeking help. Rather than community, St. Mary's was slowly becoming a place people came to for assistance rather than a place they came to for belonging. The realization that the church had been failing in its fundamental mission, building community rather than merely providing services, weighed heavily on Sister Agnes's heart as she considered how to respond to the situation with Marcus and Teresa. The easy solution would be to quietly return the Golden Cross, accept Mr. Chen's generous donation as resolution of the crisis, and move forward as if nothing had changed. But Sister Agnes understood that such an approach would waste the opportunity that the crisis had created. The theft had revealed both the depth of need in their neighborhood and the extent of caring that already existed, but remained unorganized and largely invisible. The challenge was to build something systematic and sustainable from the individual acts of generosity that had always been present. Father Miguel arrived as Sister Agnes was closing the registry book, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the thoughtful expression that meant he had been wrestling with complex questions. "I heard about Mr. Chen's donation," he said, settling into the pew beside her. "Mrs. Patterson filled me in on the basic details, but I suspect there's more to this story than I understand." Sister Agnes spent the next hour explaining everything: Zora's witness account, Marcus and Teresa's confession, the desperate circumstances that had driven 2 good children to theft, and Mr. Chen's revelation that the community had been providing support all along without the family's knowledge. "So we have the cross back, the surgery is funded, and no one has been harmed in any permanent way," Father Miguel summarized when she finished. "But you don't look like someone celebrating a crisis resolved." "Because I don't think the crisis has been resolved," Sister Agnes replied. "I think we've just postponed it. What happens to the next family that faces an $18,000 medical emergency? What happens when other teenagers find themselves choosing between crime and losing someone they love?" Father Miguel nodded slowly, understanding immediately where her thoughts were leading. "You want to use this situation to build something larger. I want to use this situation to become the church we should have been all along," Sister Agnes said. "Not just a place where people come for help during emergencies, but a place where people are connected to each other in ways that prevent emergencies from becoming catastrophic." That evening, Sister Agnes sat alone in the sanctuary of St. Mary's with her prayer journal open before her, trying to capture the profound transformation that had occurred over the past few days. The church registry book lay beside her journal, a worn leather volume that contained the names of every person baptized, confirmed, married, or buried within these walls over the past century. As she turned through the pages, Sister Agnes saw the interconnected stories of families who had supported each other through generations of joy and sorrow. The Thompson family, Marcus's grandmother Eleanor, had been baptized here in 1949, had married her late husband in 1967, and had brought Marcus for his infant baptization after his parents died. The Valdez family, Teresa had received her first communion here, and her parents had been married in a small ceremony that Mrs. Patterson still remembered fondly. The Chen family, Henry's wife, had been buried from St. Mary's 5 years earlier, and their son had graduated from the church's small religious education program before moving to California for work. Page after page revealed the deep roots that connected seemingly disparate neighbors into something larger than the sum of their individual struggles. But the registry also revealed something troubling that Sister Agnes had been trying to avoid, confronting directly. Over the past decade, fewer and fewer young families had joined the parish. Many of the names from recent years belonged to elderly parishioners or families facing crises that had brought them to the church seeking help. Rather than community, St. Mary's was slowly becoming a place people came to for assistance, rather than a place they came to for belonging. The realization that the church had been failing in its fundamental mission, building community rather than merely providing services, weighed heavily on Sister Agnes's heart as she considered how to respond to the situation with Marcus and Teresa. The easy solution would be to quietly return the Golden Cross, accept Mr. Chen's generous donation as resolution of the crisis, and move forward as if nothing had changed. But Sister Agnes understood that such an approach would waste the opportunity that the crisis had created. The theft had revealed both the depth of need in their neighborhood and the extent of caring that already existed, but remained unorganized and largely invisible. The challenge was to build something systematic and sustainable from the individual acts of generosity that had always been present. Father Miguel arrived as Sister Agnes was closing the registry book, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the thoughtful expression that meant he had been wrestling with complex questions. "I heard about Mr. Chen's donation," he said, settling into the pew beside her. "Mrs. Patterson filled me in on the basic details, but I suspect there's more to this story than I understand." Sister Agnes spent the next hour explaining everything: Zora's witness account, Marcus and Teresa's confession, the desperate circumstances that had driven 2 good children to theft, and Mr. Chen's revelation that the community had been providing support all along without the family's knowledge. "So we have the cross back. The surgery is funded, and no one has been harmed in any permanent way," Father Miguel summarized when she finished. "But you don't look like someone celebrating a crisis resolved." "Because I don't think the crisis has been resolved," Sister Agnes replied. "I think we've just postponed it. What happens to the next family that faces an $18,000 medical emergency? What happens when other teenagers find themselves choosing between crime and losing someone they love?" Father Miguel nodded slowly, understanding immediately where her thoughts were leading. "You want to use this situation to build something larger. I want to use this situation to become the church we should have been all along," Sister Agnes said. "Not just a place where people come for help during emergencies, but a place where people are connected to each other in ways that prevent emergencies from becoming catastrophic." The conversation that followed stretched late into the evening, as they explored possibilities for transforming St. Mary's from a traditional parish providing individual services into a community hub that could coordinate systematic mutual support. The idea wasn't entirely new. Churches had been serving as centers of community organization for centuries, but implementing it in a neighborhood where most families lived paycheck to paycheck would require creative approaches and careful planning. We could start with something simple, Father Miguel suggested. A community fund that people contribute to monthly, even if it's just $5 or $10. Over time, those small contributions could build into something substantial enough to help with genuine emergencies. Sister Agnes opened her journal and began sketching out possibilities. And we could expand the food pantry into something more comprehensive, not just emergency food, but organized meal sharing, bulk buying cooperatives, community gardens that reduce grocery costs for everyone. They talked about childcare cooperatives that would allow parents to work additional hours without spending their extra income on babysitting. They discussed tool libraries and skill-sharing networks that would help people maintain their homes, and cars without expensive professional services. They imagined transportation networks that would help people get to medical appointments and job interviews without relying on expensive public transit or taxis they couldn't afford. The key is making it mutual rather than charitable, Sister Agnes said as their planning session continued. People need to be contributing and receiving, helping and being helped. Nobody should feel like they're just taking from the community or just giving to it. Father Miguel agreed completely. That's what makes Mr. Chen's approach so brilliant. He wasn't just giving charity, he was investing in the community he lives in, knowing that stronger families and safer neighborhoods benefit everyone. As they talked, both of them began to envision St. Mary's as something far more ambitious than a traditional parish church. They imagined a place where people knew each other well enough to notice when families were struggling before those struggles became catastrophic. They envisioned a community where Marcus and Teresa would have had multiple people to turn to for help before desperation drove them to consider theft. But we need to be careful about how we approach Marcus and Teresa's situation. Father Miguel warned, if we handle this wrong, we could undermine everything we're trying to build. Sister Agnes had been wrestling with the same concern. The teenagers had committed a serious crime, even if they had done it for understandable reasons. Simply ignoring their actions might send the wrong message about accountability and consequences. But pursuing criminal charges against two young people who had acted from love rather than greed seemed equally problematic. I think we need to have a community meeting, she said finally. Not to put Marcus and Teresa on trial, but to have an honest conversation about what happened, why it happened, and what we can do to prevent similar situations in the future. Father Miguel looked uncertain. You want to make their situation public? I want to make the community's situation public, Sister Agnes corrected. Marcus and Teresa's choice to steal the cross was a symptom of larger problems that affect multiple families. If we address this as an individual crime, we miss the opportunity to address the systemic issues that created the crisis in the first place. The idea of calling a community meeting to discuss the theft was risky. It could expose Marcus and Teresa to community judgment and potential legal consequences, but it could also create the opportunity for genuine conversation about mutual support, shared responsibility, and the kind of community they wanted to build together. We'll need to be very careful about how we frame the conversation, Father Miguel said. This can't become a trial or an interrogation. It needs to be about healing and moving forward together. Sister Agnes agreed, and we need Marcus and Teresa to be willing participants, not reluctant defendants. This only works if they're ready to be honest about what they did and why they did it. As they prepared to end their evening planning session, Sister Agnes felt a mixture of hope and anxiety about the path they were considering. The community meeting could be transformative, creating the foundation for the kind of mutual support network that would prevent future crises. But it could also go terribly wrong, dividing the community and destroying the trust that would be necessary for any collaborative effort to succeed. "There's one more thing we need to consider, Father," Miguel said, as they gathered their notes and prepared to lock the church for the night. "Detective Harrison. He's been investigating this case, and he's going to expect some kind of resolution." Sister Agnes had been thinking about the detective as well. Robert Harrison was a good man who understood the complexities of urban policing, but he was also a professional who had responsibilities that went beyond the specific circumstances of this case. "I think we need to bring him into the conversation," she said, "not as law enforcement, but as a community member who cares about finding solutions that actually work." The decision to include Detective Harrison in their planning represented a significant step toward the kind of transparent, collaborative problem-solving that Sister Agnes hoped would characterize their new approach to community building. Instead of hiding from the legal implications of Marcus and Teresa's actions, they would address them directly while also addressing the underlying conditions that had created the crisis. As Sister Agnes walked home that night, she felt the weight of the decisions that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring conversations that could transform multiple lives, either toward healing and growth or toward division and disappointment. The Golden Cross was safe, but the real test of their community's character was just beginning. The church registry book had reminded her that St. Mary's had been serving families for nearly a century, witnessing generations of people who had faced difficult choices and found ways to support each other through crisis after crisis. Now it was her generation's turn to prove that the bonds of community could be stronger than the forces of desperation, and that love could find expression in systems of mutual care rather than desperate individual acts. The community meeting was scheduled for Sunday evening, after the regular service, but early enough that people could attend without disrupting work schedules or family routines. Sister Agnes had spent the week having careful conversations with key community members, Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Chen, Detective Harrison, and several families who had received help from St. Mary's programs over the years. Marcus and Teresa had agreed to participate, though Sister Agnes could see the anxiety in their faces as the day approached. They understood that this meeting would determine not only their own future, but potentially the future of how their community addressed crisis and mutual support. The restored Golden Cross had been returned to its place behind the altar that morning, but Sister Agnes had also placed something new beside it, a simple mason jar labeled Community Care Fund that already contained the first modest contributions from families who wanted to be part of building something better. Detective Harrison arrived early, not in uniform, but wearing the kind of casual clothes that suggested he was attending as a neighbor rather than as law enforcement. His presence sent a signal that this meeting was about community problem-solving rather than criminal prosecution, though everyone understood that his professional judgment would influence whatever resolution emerged. "I've been thinking about this situation all week," Detective Harrison told Sister Agnes as they arranged chairs in the sanctuary. "In 15 years of police work, I've learned that you can't arrest your way out of problems that are fundamentally about poverty and desperation." Mr. Chen arrived with several of his regular customers, people Sister Agnes recognized from the neighborhood, but who didn't typically attend church events. The Valdez family came together, Maria supported by Carlos, and looking more hopeful than she had in months now that her surgery was scheduled for the following week. Mrs. Williams brought Marcus and Teresa, the three of them sitting together in a pew near the front where they could be seen by everyone present. Sister Agnes noticed that Marcus was wearing his best shirt and that Teresa had taken special care with her appearance, both of them understanding that this evening would be scrutinized and remembered by their community. "Friends," Sister Agnes began when about 30 people had gathered, "we're here tonight because something happened that challenged all of our assumptions about crime, community, and how we take care of each other." She began by acknowledging the theft of the Golden Cross, not to shame Marcus and Teresa, but to establish that they were gathering to address a real situation with real consequences. She explained how 8-year-old Zora's witness account had led to understanding the true circumstances behind what had initially appeared to be simple vandalism. "Marcus and Teresa," Sister Agnes said, turning toward the teenagers who sat with their hands clasped tightly together, "would you like to tell everyone what happened and why you made the choices you made?" Marcus stood slowly, his voice shaking, as he began to speak. "We never wanted to hurt anybody or steal from the church. Teresa's mom was dying, and we had tried everything else we could think of to raise money for her surgery." As Marcus and Teresa told their story, Sister Agnes watched the faces of community members carefully. She saw surprise, understanding, sadness, and gradual recognition that these teenagers weren't criminals in any meaningful sense of the word. "We knew it was wrong," Teresa said, tears flowing freely now, "but we also knew that doing nothing meant watching someone we loved die when there might be a way to save her." The silence that followed their confession was heavy with emotion and complex understanding. These weren't strangers being judged by distant observers. These were children that many community members had watched grow up, facing a situation that any parent or loving child could understand. Mr. Chen stood next, explaining his decision to provide the money for Maria's surgery and revealing the network of quiet support that had been operating around the Valdez family's crisis. His revelation that multiple neighbors had been helping in various ways sparked conversations throughout the room as people realized how much mutual aid had been happening without coordination or recognition. "The problem isn't that people don't care about each other," Mr. Chen observed. "The problem is that we've been helping individually when we could be helping systematically." Detective Harrison spoke next, addressing the legal implications directly, but with compassion. "From a law enforcement perspective, Marcus and Teresa committed breaking and entering and theft, but prosecuting them wouldn't serve justice or community safety. What would serve both is building the kind of community where people don't feel like they have to choose between crime and losing someone they love." Sister Agnes felt a wave of gratitude toward Detective Harrison for framing the legal issues in terms of community welfare rather than punishment. His perspective gave permission for the gathering to focus on solutions rather than consequences. "So what do we do now?" asked Mrs. Rodriguez from the laundromat, the woman whose secret assistance with the Valdez family's washing had been revealed in Mr. Chen's notebook. Sister Agnes looked around the room at faces that represented decades of her ministry, people she had baptized, married, consoled during grief, and celebrated during joy. This was her community. These were her people, and this moment would define what kind of future they would build together. "We build something better," she said simply. "We build the kind of community where families don't fall through the cracks, where teenagers don't have to steal to save someone they love, and where people know they're not facing their crises alone." What happened next exceeded Sister Agnes's most optimistic expectations. Instead of judgment or condemnation, the community began sharing their own stories of crisis, support, and the times they had needed help or been able to provide it. Mrs. Patterson stood up first, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been keeping unofficial records of community need for decades. "I've been watching families struggle in this neighborhood for 20 years, she said. I've seen people lose their homes because they couldn't raise $500, watched children drop out of school because their parents needed them to work, seen good people make desperate choices because they ran out of legitimate options. Her words opened the floodgates for other community members to share their experiences. The mechanic from 3rd Street talked about the number of families whose cars he had repaired for free or at cost, knowing that reliable transportation meant the difference between employment and unemployment. The manager of the corner market explained how many customers he carried on credit between paydays, understanding that dignity and community relationships were more important than immediate payment. What we're learning tonight, Father Miguel observed as the stories continued, is that we've already been taking care of each other, but we've been doing it quietly, individually, without coordination. We've been treating symptoms instead of addressing the underlying problems. Mr. Chen stood again, this time holding his small notebook that had documented months of quiet community support. I propose we make this official, he said. Not the charity, the community care. We already know how to help each other. We need to organize it so that help arrives before people get desperate. The new community fund jar that sat beside the Golden Cross had grown throughout the evening as people had quietly added contributions. Sister Agnes noticed that even families she knew were struggling financially had found something to contribute, understanding that mutual aid worked best. When everyone participated according to their ability, Teresa's father, Carlos, stood with obvious emotion. I want everyone to know that my family will never forget what you've done for us. Maria's surgery is scheduled for this Thursday, and the doctors say her chances are excellent. But more than that, you've shown us that we are not alone in this. Community. Marcus raised his hand tentatively, and Sister Agnes nodded for him to speak. I know Teresa and I did something wrong, and we're ready to face whatever consequences are fair. But I also want to say that if we had known about all the help that was available, if we had understood that people cared this much, we never would have felt like we had to steal from our own church. Detective Harrison addressed Marcus's concern directly. The consequence I want to see is community service, not court-ordered but voluntary. I want to see you and Teresa become leaders in building the support network we're talking about tonight. Young people who understand what desperation feels like can help other young people avoid making the same choices. The suggestion transformed Marcus and Teresa from defendants into potential leaders, giving them a way to channel their experience into something positive rather than simply paying a penalty for their desperate actions. Sister Agnes felt tears in her eyes as she watched her community transform crisis into opportunity, punishment into healing, individual pain into collective strength. The golden cross behind her seemed to radiate not just its traditional message of redemption, but a new understanding of how redemption could work in practical, systematic ways. Before we finish tonight, she said, I want us to make some concrete commitments to each other, not promises we might forget next month, but practical steps we can take starting this week. The commitments that emerged were both modest and ambitious. Families agreed to contribute what they could to the community fund, amounts ranging from $5 to $50 per month, depending on their circumstances. Business owners committed to providing services at cost or below cost for community members facing emergencies. Parents organized childcare cooperatives that would allow people to work additional hours without spending their extra income on babysitting. Mr. Chen offered to coordinate a bulk buying cooperative that would reduce grocery costs for everyone. The mechanic agreed to teach basic car maintenance workshops that would help people avoid expensive repairs. Mrs. Patterson volunteered to help families navigate social services and identify resources they might not know about. Most importantly, they established a simple but effective communication network. Instead of suffering in silence when problems arose, families would reach out for help early, before small problems became catastrophic crises. The Golden Cross will always be a symbol of faith and hope, Sister Agnes said as the meeting drew to a close. But I want it to also be a reminder that redemption is something we create together, through the choices we make about how we treat each other in difficult times. As people prepared to leave, Sister Agnes noticed something remarkable happening. Instead of filing out quickly, community members lingered, talking with each other, exchanging phone numbers, making plans for the week ahead. The meeting had accomplished something she hadn't dared to hope for. It had transformed a collection of individual families into a genuine community. Marcus and Teresa approached her as the sanctuary was emptying, both of them looking lighter than she had seen them since this crisis began. "Sister Agnes," Teresa said, "thank you for helping us find a way to make this right, for helping us find a way to be part of the solution instead of just part of the problem." Sister Agnes hugged both teenagers, feeling profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them all to this moment of possibility and hope. 6 months later, on a bright spring morning that seemed to promise renewal and growth, Sister Agnes stood in the sanctuary of St. Mary's, watching 8-year-old Zora carefully add her latest drawing to a collection that now covered an entire bulletin board near the entrance to the church. This new drawing was different from the one that had started everything. Instead of figures taking something away in the darkness, Zora had created a colorful scene of people working together in broad daylight. Families sharing meals, neighbors helping to repair a roof, children playing while adults talked and planned together. At the center of the scene stood the Golden Cross, no longer alone behind an altar, but surrounded by symbols of community care and mutual support. "It's beautiful, Zora," Sister Agnes said, admiring the child's artistic progress and her evolving understanding of what she had witnessed. "You've captured something very important about how our neighborhood has changed." The changes had been remarkable and far-reaching. Maria Valdez's surgery had been successful, and she was now cancer-free and back to work, though with a reduced schedule that allowed her to spend more time with her family. The community fund that had begun with modest contributions in a mason jar had grown into something substantial enough to help multiple families avoid the kind of desperation that had driven Marcus and Teresa to theft. Teresa had not only avoided criminal charges, but had been accepted to the state university with a scholarship that covered most of her expenses. She spent her summer working as a coordinator for the community support programs that had grown out of that pivotal Sunday evening meeting. Her academic excellence, combined with her deep understanding of family crisis and community need, made her an ideal bridge between families seeking help and neighbors able to provide it. Marcus had found new purpose as well. His natural leadership, skills, and his understanding of the pressures facing young people in their neighborhood had made him invaluable in organizing activities and support programs for teenagers. The worn basketball that had sat unused behind Patterson's Market was now part of a community recreation program that gave young people alternatives to the streets and opportunities to build relationships across age and family lines. The community fund helped the Rodriguezes when Mr. Rodriguez got injured at work, Zora explained, pointing to various elements in her drawing. And Mrs. Chen teaches cooking classes now that her husband started the bulk buying group. And Marcus coaches basketball for the little kids. Each detail Zora mentioned represented a success story that had grown from the systematic approach to mutual aid they had developed after the crisis with the Golden Cross. Instead of responding to emergencies after they became catastrophic, the community had learned to provide early intervention that prevented small problems from becoming desperate situations. The bulletin board, where Zora's drawings were displayed, had become a focal point for community communication. Families posted requests for help, offers of service, success stories and expressions of gratitude. What had once been hidden networks of individual assistance had become visible, coordinated, and more effective than anyone had imagined possible. Mrs. Patterson, now 73 but more energetic than ever, had become the unofficial coordinator of community services. Her desk, once cluttered with church administrative paperwork, now served as mission control for a network of mutual support that extended far beyond traditional parish boundaries. Her filing system had evolved to track not just church membership, but community needs, available resources, and successful matches between people who could help and people who needed assistance. "The beauty of what we've built," Mrs. Patterson told Sister Agnes during one of their weekly planning meetings, "is that it's not charity. It's genuine mutual aid. Everyone contributes something, everyone receives something, and everyone's dignity remains intact." The distinction was crucial to the program's success. Unlike traditional charity, which created relationships between givers and receivers, the St. Mary's Community Care Network operated on the principle that everyone had something valuable to offer and everyone would occasionally need help. The computer programmer who contributed financial support to the emergency fund also benefited from Mr. Chen's bulk buying cooperative and the community childcare program. The elderly woman, who couldn't contribute money, shared her sewing skills and helped with childcare while receiving help with transportation and home maintenance. Detective Harrison had become a regular participant in community meetings, not as law enforcement, but as a neighbor interested in preventive approaches to problems that often ended up requiring police intervention. His perspective on the connections between poverty, desperation, and crime had helped the community understand how their mutual aid work served public safety as well as individual families. 6 months ago, I was investigating a church theft. Detective Harrison reflected during a recent community meeting. Today, I'm looking at a neighborhood where crime rates have dropped, where families are more stable, and where young people have positive alternatives to the streets. This is how real community policing works, by building communities strong enough that people don't need to turn to crime. Father Miguel had found his role evolving as well. Instead of primarily providing individual pastoral care, he had become a facilitator for community organizing and systematic mutual support. Sunday services now included regular updates on community projects, celebrations of successful assistance provided and received, and planning for expanding their network of care. The Golden Cross itself had taken on new meaning. Still prominently displayed behind the altar, it now shared space with symbols of community care, photographs of successful projects, letters of gratitude from families who had been helped, and small tokens representing the various ways people contributed to their collective well-being. As Sister Agnes prepared for the morning service, she reflected on how profoundly her understanding of ministry had changed over the past 6 months. For 43 years, she had tried to serve God's people by providing individual assistance during crises. But the theft of the Golden Cross had revealed a more powerful approach, building communities strong enough that individual crises didn't become catastrophic, creating networks of mutual support that prevented desperation rather than merely responding to it after the damage was done. Zora's latest drawing seemed to capture this transformation perfectly. The child who had witnessed 2 teenagers stealing from their church in desperation had now witnessed an entire community learning to take care of each other systematically, intentionally, and with love. The darkness and secrecy of theft had been replaced by the openness and collaboration of mutual aid. As families began arriving for the service, Sister Agnes felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought them all to this place. The Golden Cross had been stolen and recovered, But something far more valuable had been discovered in the process: the power of community to transform individual desperation into collective strength, and the possibility of building systems of care that honored both human dignity and human interdependence. The pain of losing something sacred had been transformed into the joy of finding something even more precious, a community that knew how to love each other, not just in words, but in the practical, systematic ways that made love visible in daily life.